So as this is a virtual event, I invite you all to acknowledge in the chat where you're located if you would like. I also invite folks to learn more about what land they're on and their treaty responsibilities, which you can do at native-land.ca. We're also approaching September 30th, which is Orange Shirt Day, or National Truth and Reconciliation Day. And so I invite you all to reflect on how Canada has or hasn't, as a nation, made progress on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, and also how you can engage with these calls to action as an individual, especially as they relate to reproductive justice and health. And you can check this out just by Googling Beyond 94, and it's like a CBC resource that should pop up. So we're going to begin the presentation now, so please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Kerry Duncan. Kerry is an academically trained and community-educated white, queer, and disabled full-time family caregiver. They have 15 plus years experience with activist collectives, nonprofits, and unions, often involving direct action tactics, from planning for mass mobilizations to building up responsive counter-protesting efforts. Kerry is the coordinator at Oak Brook Brock, a campus and community organization here in Niagara that is focused on connecting people to activism and resources. So Kerry, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone, and thanks to ARCC for having me with all these great speakers today. It's going to seem counterintuitive, but I'm going to start by saying I'm actually a bad counter-protester, or I struggle with counter-protesting, which might seem counterintuitive to be on this panel. But I do come as an experienced protester. I've been arrested on Parliament and had to go to court, and I had to be I was at the G20 for 11 days. When I moved to Niagara 10 years ago, one of the first things I did was hold a sign that said, "These people are liars," outside a bunch of anti-choicers outside my house. And the call to action is something I've participated in since I was 6 years old, and the Harris administration was cutting teachers, And through my life and through the last 16 years, the thing I've learned is that I'm actually a better organizer than counter-protester. I struggle with my temper, and I struggle to de-escalate in the moment inside myself. But so instead, I've moved towards a world where I coordinate marshals and I coordinate safety. And I really want to focus a lot on the ways we need to reimagine safety to incorporate things like harm reduction into our organizing spaces, how we build up sustainability opposed to just reactionary moments. And the other thing, as Mark mentioned, I'm a caregiver. I'm a full-time caregiver to my brother. So when I lived in Ottawa for 5 years, I was able to be arrested without the same level of risk, where like now I need to take more caution when I enter into spaces because I can't get arrested. My brother relies on me for safety and food and everything. So to start off today, I want us to think about what we assume is a safer space and break down perfectionism. Often safer spaces and the word safety gets deemed as an adjective or a noun. It's seen as an absolute. Something goes perfectly well or perfectly not. However, a commitment to safety, sorry, I have a noisy pen in my hand. I'm going to take that down. A commitment to safety is actually a verb. It's an ongoing commitment to the team you're working with and to yourself to decide why you want to enter into a space. It's not one thing or the other thing. It's a question to yourself about why you enter into it. Too often when we think of activism, we do think of marches and showing up, which 100% is part of this work. But then when we also have to think about who that work cuts out. Who cannot show up in those ways? And what other roles do we need to be incorporating into our counter-protesting? I've realized that I'm much better as the supplies person, which is the person during a counter-protest who's not that far away, but has all the signs or has a vehicle if someone needs a drive or needs picked up. And I'm better at coordinating marshals and reaching out to people ahead of time and building up these like longer schedules and systems before we enter into the in-person stuff. In Niagara, however, I do show up a lot around marshalling, and we'll get into that in a minute, but I want us to think about how we prioritize showing up and who we're showing up for. So in a counter protest or in a protest, we look at numbers, we look at quantity of people. However, this is a model that only goes so far. I want people to be able to show up not just twice, but 10 times for 10 years. And so to do that, we have to look at all the different strategies for keeping people safe and keeping people involved. Does that involve a standardized masking process across your different organizing teams? Is that possible? Or if we did a marshaling session the other day for Overdose Awareness Day, and we had to talk about, there are lots of folks who have different politics around things like masking, who have had family members who have experienced overdose, and we have to keep them safe in our spaces. In Niagara, we have especially St. Catharines, we have a lot of homeless neighbors, and they often get blamed for causing escalations and harm in our downtown. However, we're protesting in their space, in their homes. And so when we're looking at building up inclusivity and showing up, there are things like panhandling. Panhandling happens outside tons of rallies and tons. And rather than being like, sorry, I don't have change, something we train people on is having change, having smokes, having a lighter, and making sure that people who are there and will be there after the rally's over can also feel included in that space and not feel judged. And then the other thing is thinking about our teams. Like, our teams can't show up constantly. We have jobs, we are family members, we are workers, we are all these things. So how can we meet people's needs as in our organizing team, allow them to ask questions ahead of time, and also debrief? These are all different strategies that slow things down. I will admit that, like, I am a take time and plan it out type person, which isn't always possible. However, then we see really innovative strategies come the more we talk about safety options. So I had the great privilege of visiting the U of T encampment earlier this year, and just the measures of safety they took to be able to show up for Palestinian students and people both locally and globally was so impressive to me. It was such a learning moment for me around the vetting system, which is something we don't have a lot of practice on here in Niagara, or my experience in Ottawa. But so I would request to all of you to think about where you're showing up and how you're learning about safety. How are you learning about what you're comfortable and not comfortable with? And what models do you want to start to learn and incorporate into your spaces? For me, the biggest thing I've realized as a queer and trans person is having spaces without police, because we have direct recommendations from community members to have alternatives to policing in our spaces. And so that call to action includes coming up with a marshaling program and committing to the marshaling program. And it means bringing more people into the marshaling program. We've had the great opportunity to work with a running group here in Niagara who might not show up to our organizing meetings, who might not always know how to counter protest or talk about politics perfectly, but they love safety, outdoor safety, and they have been so encouraging around showing up for Overdose Awareness Day, for Trans Day of Visibility, for May Day, for all of these different moments where we need marshals, and we need to make sure police are not prioritized as any form of safety, because those who are most marginalized are saying we don't feel safe there. And so I can get into all the ins and outs of marshaling and how to do outreach, or how to build a marshaling tract, or how to do marshaling for groups when you're not the leader of that group, or you're not directly involved in that issue, if you want to ask about in the Q&A. But the thing I just want to leave folks with is, it's okay to not love protesting or feel like you are a bad counter protester. There is not an absolute. And I think there's always a role for everyone in activism. We just have to be building out those roles if we want to look at safety in a sustainable long-term way. I could ramble about this for a long time because I love talking about how we work as communities, but I think I'll hand it back to Mark. I think that's time.
Thanks so much, Kerry. That was great. Yeah, I really appreciate the points about, considering all of our different identities and how we can show up best, even just based on our if you have a temper sometimes, maybe counter protesting isn't for you, but there's lots of other spaces where we need folks. So that's really great. Thank you. So our next speaker is Erin. Erin is a proud member of Niagara Reproductive Justice, who also runs a doula practice, a quiet place for people who have experienced or are currently experiencing miscarriage, abortion, termination for medical reasons, stillbirth, or infant loss. Erin holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Waterloo in Social Development Studies, where she specialized in social policy and social action, as well as social work. Erin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here so that we can have some slides up. Can everyone see that? Mark, can you confirm? Perfect. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Margaret. My name is Erin Bierzychudek, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am a very proud member of Niagara Reproductive Justice, and I'm here representing them today. We are a mutual aid group located in Niagara Region in Southern Ontario that helps people access reproductive supports. One of the ways that we do that is through our abortion and reproductive support network, where I volunteer with, and we directly support clients in accessing abortion. We have another sub-team that also monitors anti-choice activity, and that's going to be the team sort of that is the focus of today's talk from my point of view. And I do also have a private doula practice called A Quiet Space, where I support clients who are experiencing or who have experienced in the past abortion, miscarriage, TFMR, which is termination for medical reasons, stillbirth, or infant loss. And if anyone wants to reach out to Niagara Reproductive Justice or myself personally, I've listed my contact details there on the bottom of the slide. And I'm happy to chat with anybody about any of the things that I've mentioned today, or if you have additional questions. What I'm here to talk about today is counter-protesting. And so everything I'm talking about today is going to be based on Niagara Reproductive Justice's Counter-Protesting 101 guide. You can see it there on the right side of your screen. You can find the whole guide online on our website, which is niagarareproductivejustice.com. It's at the top. If you select on the Monitoring Anti-Choicers tab and you scroll down the page, there's an area called Safety Guides, and you can click on the Counter-Protesting in Niagara 101 guide that you see there. You can view it online or download it as a PDF. Now, it does say counter-protesting in Niagara, but most of the information contained in it is going to be applicable regardless of where you're located. There might be some Niagara-specific information, but I think it's a really great resource for anybody who's interested in counter-protesting so that you can have a safe and effective counter-protest. And so in order to promote that today, I'm going to go over our sort of top 3 tips for counter-protesting. So the first tip here is tip number 1, dress to counter-protest. So a lot of people might not put time into thinking about what they're going to wear to a protest or a counter-protest, but it's actually really important and really impactful to consider what your appearance is going to give away about your identity, and also how that's going to present to the world in terms of, especially if you're showing up as a group. So the first thing I want to talk about is what not to wear to one of these protests. So you definitely want to avoid wearing anything that identifies who you are as an individual. So that includes where you work, where you go to school, where you attend religious services. So you definitely don't want to show up in your university sweatsuit, identifying where you go to school, or wearing a polo shirt that has your workplace on it, or a hat with your church, or anything like that. So you really want to try to stick to things where, there's no logos on it or anything like that, so that there's no affiliations made. And in addition to that, this is a little bit tougher, but you also don't want to wear any clothing that may mistake you for being a member of the protesting group itself. So it might involve a little bit of research to determine, are folks going to be showing up all wearing a purple shirt or all dressing in a certain manner, so that you can plan ahead of time to not wear those same things, so that you aren't potentially identified as a member of the opposing group. Now, in terms of what to wear, the number one thing that we recommend people wear is a mask. And COVID gave us an interesting gift in this way because it really normalized mask wearing. And it also gave us access to masks really easily as opposed to before. Previously, people might have worn medical masks or something like a balaclava or a scarf. But wearing a mask is the easiest way to not only protect your health, but also protect your identity. Once you have that on your face, it's really hard for facial recognition software or for other people seeing you to be able to identify who you are. So that's our number one. Moving on from there, you also want to wear clothing that covers up any personally identifying details. So things like tattoos, scars, piercings, unique hairstyles, things like that. So for myself, as someone with a significant number of tattoos that are visible, I always make sure that I'm wearing something where it's long sleeves. I have red hair that can be identifiable, so maybe I'm wearing a hat. If you have piercings that are unusual in any way, maybe you want to take them out, or again, if you're wearing a mask, it can help to cover those up. And going back to what not to wear, you want to wear clothing that differentiates you from the protesters. So if you are at an anti-abortion protest, maybe you want to wear a shirt that says abortion is healthcare on it or something like that. That's really going to help you stand out from those anti-choicers. And this is where masks come in also, because especially at anti-choice protests, a lot of those folks are also anti-maskers. So if you're wearing a mask, it is really going to differentiate you from them. And last but certainly not least, we really advocate that you wear comfortable shoes and clothing. Standing around on concrete for an hour or more can be really, really uncomfortable. So you want to make sure that you're wearing something where you can move around easily, and so that when you're standing around, you're not going to be getting sore. And in addition to this, that also accounts for dressing for the weather. We want to make sure folks are wearing sunscreen, you're wearing a raincoat if it's raining, or if the weather is cold, that you're wearing hats, mitts, gloves, that kind of thing. So that's tip number one. Moving on to tip number two, it's pick your battles. And so what we're talking about here is that choosing to interact or not with protesters should be a deliberate and ideally predetermined decision. So this is especially important if you show up as a group, but also on an individual basis. You really want to think ahead of time before you show up to an event about how you want to interact with the people that are there. So a couple of points here. It may be an effective strategy to waste protesters' times by engaging with them if you are in an environment where this could prevent them from speaking to others. So say, for example, you are on a university campus, or you're in a downtown street where there's a lot of foot traffic or something like that. If you can engage with protesters and prevent them from speaking to somebody else who might be passing by, this can be a really effective way of preventing those interactions. But it's not going to be effective if this is a protest where most people who are passing by seeing them are in their cars. So you really want to think about that, the environment that you're in ahead of time, and determine whether or not you think engaging with them is a good idea. And if you do decide to interact with them, there's some points here to remember. You could be mistaken for being one of their supporters. And this goes back to our previous slide, where we really want to make sure that we dress appropriately to differentiate yourself. If by some chance, like I said, they all show up in purple shirts, maybe the person that decides to engage with them isn't the person who happened to show up wearing a purple shirt or something like that, right? So we really want to make sure that you aren't looking to add to their numbers when people see you standing there, that you want to be differentiated from them. And super important here is to remember that you are extremely unlikely to change a protester's mind. So they're there because they're passionate just like you are. And so you want to remember that the goal here is not to convince them that they're wrong. It's going to be impossible, and it's just going to leave you emotionally exhausted. What the goal is to waste their time. And so if you want to interact with them for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, or anything like that, where they're not going to be able to interact with somebody else, that can be great, but you always want to make sure that you're protecting yourself mentally and to leave when necessary before any harm occurs. A lot of times, especially with anti-choicers, you're going to be standing in close proximity to graphic images or hearing things that are really negative, that are factually incorrect, and you in no way want to put yourself in harm's way. And so you, again, want to have a discussion ahead of time, who is prepared to interact with these protesters, who is not prepared, and to make those kinds of decisions as a group. And so if you are there with a group, just remember that the actions that you do take can affect everyone and compromise your or their safety. And so when you make this predetermined decision, you want to make sure that you stick with it. You get there, tensions flare, emotions rise. But if you've decided ahead of time that you're not going to be interacting with those protesters, you want to make sure that that is the stance that you keep. And if you want to change that, or if something else comes up, that's maybe a discussion that you need to have amongst the group. And thirdly, there we go. Okay. Tip number 3 is know thyself and others. And so here it's really critical to consider your positionality and that of everyone in your group. So the considerations you want to take here is consider who in your group might be vulnerable to interactions with police. So people who might have precarious immigration status, people of the global majority, members of marginalized communities, and those who might have had previous police interactions. And if there are any of those folks in your group, you want to make sure that you have an exit strategy for them in case they need to leave if the police show up. So maybe you say they're going to walk this way, here's where vehicles are located, or anything like that. And again, this is where having that briefing ahead of time is going to be really important. And if you're not someone who's likely to face violence from police or others, part of your role is to help ensure that others are kept safe. And so if something does happen, know how you can support them, but also make sure that you're not taking any actions that could put other people in harm's way. Another thing is you really want to consider if taking photos of people for social media or anything like that is going to expose them to potential risks or harms. I know lots of groups want to take pictures because they, are attending these events and they might want to share them, but you really want to think about whether or not you're going to be outing someone's identity. So a really good workaround for this is, especially if you're holding protest signs or anything like that, is just to have people hold the signs up in front of their faces to make sure that their identity is shielded. Now, on the other hand, you also need to consider that the protesters might be taking photos or videos of your group members. And so this is another reason why you want to shield your identity from the very beginning. So as soon as people get out of their vehicles or get off of public transit, to have a mask on and everything like that. And again, why you might want to make decisions ahead of time about engagement, because these snapshots that people take are only a moment in time. And so you want to really consider when those images or videos get shared, what the public perception of that might be. And lastly, I just want to remind everyone that when one person takes a certain action, it can and often does affect every member of the group. And so when you are counter-protesting, the number one thing is that it is always safety first. There is no room here for hero egos, saviorism, main character personalities, or anything like that. It is supposed to be a safe and effective protest, and you can't have one without the other. And I will hand it back to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Erin. That was great. That guide is incredible. And yeah, I've definitely learned a lot from that. So thank you so much for sharing. Our next speaker will be Nora. So Nora is the co-president of the U of T Students for Choice, University of Toronto Students for Choice. She's a board member at SRHR Hubs and a board member as well at ARC. They are a community organizer, activist, and care worker in the anti-gender-based violence and SRHRJ field, highlighting the role and intersections of queer and trans liberation in these areas. They are also involved with countering graphic anti-abortion displays on campus through the Rapid Response Project by Students for Choice. Nora?
Hi, folks. I am so excited to be here with you today. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm just going to wait for Avreet to share my slides if you're able to do that. Thank you. So I will pretty much just get into it. So as Margaret said in the introduction, my name is Nora, she, they pronouns. I am the co-president of U of T Students for Choice, along with Avreet, who is one of our fellow board members and who will be speaking after me. And I'll be speaking about our rapid response team and rapid response project that we do on the U of T campus at U of T Students for Choice. So who are we, first and foremost? We are a student group at the University of Toronto who works to support and uphold principles of reproductive justice, including but not limited to abortion care and rights. And so this kind of will give you a little bit of history because I think it's relevant to this. Avreet actually started this group back in her first year at U of T as a result of seeing graphic anti-abortion imagery on our campus and seeing how jarring it was and that no one was doing anything about it. So since then, we have sort of grown and we've continued to sort of develop this group and our network and community of people who are very committed to countering this graphic anti-abortion imagery that can be very traumatizing, very upsetting, very anger-inducing. And we do a lot of things on campus like tabling. We also do the actual countering to the anti-abortion imagery, which I'll get into in a moment. That also includes places like our clubs fairs at U of T, since that's one of the times when they're most prominent and show up with the most people. We've also hosted counter protests to the March for Life that happens in Toronto annually, as well as different things like their quote unquote life chain that they do. So that's basically who we are and what our sort of mission is with our rapid response project, but I'll get into that in a second. So what is our rapid response project? Essentially, this is students who are mobilizing against graphic anti-abortion imagery on the University of Toronto campuses. This is typically done by using signs, flags, cardboard, etc., to block really whatever you can get your hands on. And we do this not only just to show up and be there and show that there is a voice against what they're doing, but also to block this imagery that students are having to see on our campuses as they're just trying to get to class, get back home, go to work, and not just students, but community members as well, since our campus is open to everyone, basically. So that's something that we are very committed to doing and that we have done for the last few years and that we will keep doing as we move forward. So I think something that people often ask is like, how do we mobilize students on campus? And one of the major ways that we do this is through education, as well as showing students that there is a place for them to feel safe on campus in response to this graphic anti-abortion imagery. And we give them ways to mobilize and process heavy feelings through action while keeping each other safe. So that is something that, as I've sort of sat with it more, my thoughts have sort of developed and grown a lot on it, and I'm really excited to be able to show you here, like share these here with you today. And I think something that I think a lot about is, like people sort of ask, like, what are the best ways to get people to know what's going on? And, we see this graphic imagery everywhere. It's not just limited to Toronto. We see it all across Canada. And I think one of the things that sort of comes up with that and something that we work on at ARC that I'm very grateful for is countering that through policy and through law as well. And to hopefully get bylaws passed, which many cities have, but many cities are also resistant to that, which we'll kind of get into a little bit in a second. So I think something that I really want to touch on today is how do we equip students with the knowledge to mobilize? And I think both Kerry and Erin both shared so many amazing tips and knowledge that we like to share with students on our campus as well. But there's some other things that I kind of want to touch on that they both are further that they both already touched on. So essentially what we do at U of T Students for Choice is that we do trainings with our membership that center the fundamentals of reproductive justice and our recommendations for safe mobilization practices based off of our experiences and the things that we've seen and what our values are as a group. So essentially, some of the things that we sort of talk on in these trainings that we do, it's a training that I developed and that I facilitate. Excuse me. are things like, we always hear like the typical land acknowledgement stuff like that, which is great. We should be doing land acknowledgements and following that practice. But we like to dive into it a little bit more and talk about why reproductive justice and doing this work must be decolonial, and why we must hold anti-colonial frameworks in the work that we're doing. And so that's one thing that we touch on. And I know this might seem a little bit strange talking about like mobilization as well as like the other things I'm going to mention in a second, but I'll kind of explain the thought process behind that and why I very explicitly wanted to include that in our trainings. So that's one of the things. Another thing is, excuse me, talking about the language that we use. So using gender neutral language, as well as talking about the intersections of these issues in terms of like, queer and trans rights and queer and trans liberation, disability justice, harm reduction, and basically centering the intersections of this work in terms of how medical care and autonomy are often something that most people, especially if they are marginalized in some sort of way or experiencing marginalization in some sort of way, and at its intersections, how that's something that we don't often get. And in terms of that safety. We also equip them with the right language when they're talking about abortion, and we unpack abortion stigma and sort of best practices in terms of language that people use when speaking about abortion, and do it like when they're trying to educate, when they're talking to their friends, when they're speaking about this in a school project or to their families. Basically just equipping them with the right language while they're going through this work. And the reason that we do this, and the reason that I think it's really important to mention all of these things very explicitly as part of our training, is because that essentially is one of the ways in which we are working to not reproduce harm. Because as was mentioned by the other speakers before me, it's something that oftentimes you don't have people that are able to show up in a space how they otherwise might be able to, or they might not feel welcome in a space, or whatever intersections they hold don't allow them to show up for whatever reason, how they might otherwise. And so that's something that I think is really important, and it allows people to build capacity. It allows people to build community. And I think as I've moved through this work, it's something that I've recognized as very vital to, instead of just kind of telling people to show up, you really need to be able to give them the tools to work as a team. And there's a sort of reason for that, which I will get into once I touch on my first sort of tip in the next slide. So that leads to our recommendations. So first and foremost, we always recommend, while also respecting people's autonomy to make those decisions for themselves and know their own risks, to not speak to anti-abortion people. That is something that we kind of like to stress, while again stressing the point of the fact that we respect their autonomy. But as a team, it's something that we don't do, because the way I kind of like to frame this is, we are here for friends, and friends being community. We are here for friends and in community, not to feed the fascists. And I think that's something that the more I have seen us center that, the stronger our teams have gotten in being able to recognize what our actual goal is. Yes, we are here to counter and to block, and we are also here to create what is hopefully going to be a safe space, or to let people know that they have a safe space in which witnessing this graphic anti-abortion imagery on our campuses is not acceptable, and that there is no place for them in our campuses, in our cities, or anywhere. We also like to make signage accessible as a student group on campus. So there is an office that is fairly central to our campus where we keep all of our signs, and students can just go in and request them from the people that are sitting at the front desk, and they're able to go and choose whatever signs they need if they come across it. Since, as I mentioned, oftentimes what will happen is that people are just, finishing up a class, they're on their way to class, and they see it, right? They're not always ready. It's not always like a planned protest or counter protest where they've been able to bring their own stuff, as well as like flags and stuff like that. So that's something that we also like to do. Another thing that I think is really important when we're talking about blocking graphic imagery, as opposed to just being present and countering them, which is also a very valid way to do this, and something that we also encourage and support, is not kettling people in. like the people that are holding the graphic imagery. And so what we essentially say is block as much of the imagery as possible while still giving them a way to exit. Because something that we have seen oftentimes with this is that they have tried to claim like forcible confinement or something like that, when the reality is we just don't want you here. You are welcome to leave. We want you to leave. So that's something that I like to stress to people a lot when we talk about this, and when we do our trainings, or just when people ask for like tips on like, how do I actually go about doing this? So we will often sort of stand in ways that can shield the graphic imagery, but still allow them a way out, so they can't claim that, especially because we know that cops don't keep us safe. And if they show up, there is definitely a chance that they will escalate, or that the anti-abortion protesters will escalate. And that will definitely disproportionately, it will harm many people, but it will disproportionately harm those who are experiencing marginalization at those intersections where we have seen that they are not kept safe. And lastly, what we always say too is do not call police or campus police. And the reason for this is, unless your campus or whatever school's campus you are on, or whatever city you're in, has explicit policies or bylaws against graphic imagery, they are legally allowed to be there, which is why the advocacy that we are doing at ARC, and why community members coming together to advocate against graphic imagery is so important to pass these bylaws. But that is something that we have to be very mindful of, because essentially what we've been told is that, you know, if you call campus safety and are like, these people are making me feel really unsafe, is there anything that you can do about it? Or saying that like, there's someone that's making me feel unsafe at XYZ place, and they show up there. We have been told that it is akin to filing a false police report, which can get you in trouble. So that's something that we also really like to stress, whether it is to students, many of which are international students and do not have citizenship here, or PR. And it's also just overall not a situation that any of us want to be in, because we know, once again, that cops don't keep us safe, and it is not, it's just generally not the best way to go about things, and we have seen it firsthand. So that is a sort of recommendation that we like to give to people, or a tip of sorts. And yeah, I think those are some of the main things. Another thing that I'll also mention is something that came up with the other speakers as well, which is masking. And there are multiple reasons for this, the first of which being accessibility, and making sure that folks who are disabled or chronically ill are able to show up and engage in that space in a way that is safe for them, and keeping everybody safe, and not spreading airborne viruses, as well as just personal safety and being able to block up, so to speak, and not become recognizable, since we know that the vast majority of the time these anti-abortion protesters are filming. They are filming either for their own social media content, which they obviously will not ask your consent or permission to post online, as well as if there is an escalation, you know, not being able to be as identifiable. So those are generally things that we tend to stress to people that come and just ask us in general, or through our trainings. So yeah, and then last slide. So in conclusion, the sort of framework that we use for this work, especially in being trauma-informed, and doing this work through a trauma-informed lens, and being a group that very actively centers and prioritizes that, since we know that this is so traumatizing and people have so many vast experiences with abortion or pregnancy loss, is that we are there to support everyone's right to autonomy and to make the decisions that feel best for them. And inherently in doing that, what our goal is to make people feel empowered to be able to mobilize, and even if they are not in a position to mobilize, so that they have the tools that they can pass along, because skill building and knowledge building is such a fundamental part of doing this work, and being able to actually show up, or make sure that people in your community are able to show up. And so along with that, something that we make sure to do as well is, after something like this happens, or just in general, we always have peer support that's available. And we are always committed to getting people connected to further resources that they might need. Just one, because it's the right thing to do. Secondly, just again, working in a trauma-informed framework, as well as allowing people to feel empowered and to be able to process their emotions in a different way that might feel best for them. So yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. And that's the contact information for U of T Students for Choice, as well as myself on the screen. If they like take a screenshot, or I will send these slides to Joyce afterwards and they'll be sent out to you, or you can see them in the recording afterwards. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nora. Yeah, I love that you drew like sort of the parallels between like, you know, bodily autonomy and also ensuring that folks feel and know that they have the right to show up and make decisions that feel best for them in their activism as well. And don't be the fascist. That's great. I want that on a sticker. So our next speaker is Avreet, our next and final speaker. So Avreet is a student at the University of Toronto, studying political science and critical studies in equity and solidarity. She became involved in reproductive justice related work through campus involvement after starting a pro-choice club in her first year at the U of T Students for Choice, which Nora just spoke about, which counters the graphic anti-abortion displays on campus. Avreet is also a national youth organizer with Amnesty International, supporting the coordination of actions for their campaigns. Avreet joined the ARC board a year ago and serves on the Reproductive Justice Strategic Planning and CPC project committees. So Avreet, take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I think it should be up. Okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to be looking to the side of it because I have some notes next to me. So sorry if that's a distraction, but my name is Avreet. I'm super happy and excited to be here. And my portion of the workshop is going to be about virtual events and how to stay safe during them. I'll be sharing some best practices for hosting these digital events. And really since the onset of the pandemic, which many people continue to be deeply, deeply impacted by, digital events in a lot of ways have just become our new normal. And our work as progressive activists and organizers must continue. And so a lot of the times events hosted virtually over Zoom or similar platforms are just what make the most sense. And it is still important to stay safe at these events. It is still definitely very possible for safety to be compromised online. And it's important to implement safety practices that will keep everyone safe, including hosts and organizers, as well as audience members. So a little bit about me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. My name is Avreet. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from what is now known as Toronto, but for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I wear many hats, but I've written the three that I think are most relevant to why I'm here today, which Margaret also mentioned, but I'm a full-time student at the University of Toronto, where I do a lot of reproductive justice related advocacy on campus. I'm also a board member at ARC, which is a wonderful experience. I love it here. And then third, I'm a national organizer with Amnesty International Canada. So this is actually something I've done since high school. And the screenshot at the top is of one of the first online events I ever organized. I'm in the corner, kind of blurry, but it was an event for justice for Indigenous children. And we had a webinar as well as a letter writing event. And so it's through Amnesty International that I have most of my online digital planning experience. So yeah, let's jump right into it. Firstly, I want to talk a bit about platforms because the one that you decide to use for your online event really does matter. They're usually, like, I feel like when we think about virtual events, we automatically think about Zoom, which makes a lot of sense because a lot of them do take place there, but live events on social media, such as going live on Instagram or TikTok, they also count as online events, and they are definitely an option. So there are a number of things to consider when you're deciding which one to go for. What is the format of the event? Is it a keynote? Is it a panel? Is it a town hall? How do you want participants to be able to engage? Do you want them to actively contribute or more so actively listen? And is it more of a formal event or an informal event? How often does it occur, for example? What is the duration of the event? And who is your event for? How do you want people to be able to access it? Sometimes it definitely does make sense to use social media. It's there for a reason. For example, if it's an informal Q&A where people who follow you get to know your organization better, and you do this like once a week. I think that's a good example of when you might want to use Instagram Live. But my first tip is to use video conferencing platforms such as Zoom whenever it's possible and practical. And really, the bottom line here is that you just have so much more control when you're using platforms like Zoom. You have a lot more settings and options available to you so that you can really customize and set up the online space in a way that meets the needs of your event. And there's two other points I'd like to touch on here is that these platforms are usually better for protecting personal identity, and they can also be more accessible in some ways. So they help protect personal identity because when you live stream on social media, everyone has access to what account you're hosting it from. And this may not be a big deal if you're hosting it from your organizational account rather than your personal account. But if you have speakers or guests, their social media is also on display for everyone to see, which may be a privacy and confidentiality concern. And everyone is also often able to view who else is attending and viewing the event. When you join an Instagram Live, you can usually just scroll through a list of who else is watching. So your audience members may also have their privacy compromised, and this may deter people from wanting to join if they know that their private social media handle will be available and accessible to anyone else who's attending. And some people may not know this, and they might put themselves at risk unknowingly. The second point is that doing events on social media requires that audience members have social media in the first place to attend the event or to even know what's going on. And this may be inaccessible to a lot of folks who just don't use social media, and you may be limiting access to who knows about your event and who is able to attend your event in a way that isn't necessarily fair. Okay. So my second tip is to control who has access to your event. And for the most part, when I say this just means requiring participants to register in advance if you can, instead of just widely sharing the Zoom link publicly. You want to do this so that you know how many people are attending, you're prepared for that number of people. And also people kind of have to intentionally think through whether they want to attend the event and whether they want to register. So it is less likely that you will have random agitators or people who should not be there. It also gives you a list of registrants. So if it's possible, or if you think it's necessary, you may want to consider just vetting that list quickly. And this definitely does not need to be a formal process, but since you have the list of people who have registered, you may want to do a quick skim through the list and see if you recognize any names. For example, the name of someone who has harassed you in your inbox or left nasty comments online, or someone you may know to be a far-right reporter or agitator, for example. Since you have access to this list in advance, if you see a name like that you recognize, you can take necessary action well in advance. And you can just overall avoid them showing up and surprising you during the actual event. If applicable, you may also want to limit who is eligible to attend the event. For example, if it's only for students or only for internal staff and members of your organization, or if you're working alongside a number of organizations, staff and members of the associated groups. When people are registering, you can ask them, for example, to sign up with their school email or work email to confirm that they are part of the groups that you are limiting the event to. All right, so the next tip is to utilize settings to your advantage. This is really why Zoom and video conferencing is the way to go, because you have so much agency over how you want your online space to look. I would definitely recommend setting up a waiting room and accepting participants manually. And you may also want to take the extra step of cross-referencing the registration list. However, this may not be necessary. If you do require people to register in advance, usually it's only those people who will have access to the Zoom link, but it's always an extra safety precaution you can take just in case. You can also choose to mute participants. If you would like them to engage, you can play around with Q&A settings or polls for audience engagement. You can also decide whether the chat is open or closed, or whether it's open and they can only reach a host. And you can use webinar settings so that the audience can't even see each other. And then that way there's no accidents, no one's accidentally unmuted or accidentally turns on their camera, etc. And then my fourth tip, I think, is a really important one. It's to establish guidelines and expectations really clearly. And these are things you want to think about when you're still in the planning phase of the event. And then you want to share them both with your audience and with your panelists and guests very explicitly. So I would establish these guidelines and then share them in advance, such as when they register or an email that goes out, for example, as a reminder a week before the event, as well as verbally at the beginning of the event. And when you're setting these guidelines, you might want to consider things like asking the audience to stay unmuted, whether you want cameras on or off, or you don't really care either way, letting people know where their questions or comments can be directed, as well as establishing guidelines for use of the chat. And then whether you would maybe like to request them not to take pictures, videos, or screenshots. I will say, although you can control a lot on Zoom, you can't control this. You won't be notified if people take screenshots of the screen, or they can always just use their phone and take a picture of their screen manually. And so rule of thumb is if it's something that you would not want in a picture or a video, you might not want to say or do it while you're in the event. And then it's always good to have an anti-discrimination policy. And in advance, you also want to map out with your organizing team what will happen if guidelines are violated by an audience member or even someone who's part of the event as a host or a panelist. So, for example, will someone get 2 chances and on the 3rd strike they get removed? Or do they get a private reminder sent to them via the chat to follow the guidelines and expectations? You want to also be clear about what does happen if guidelines are violated. For example, you may let people know at the beginning of the event that you absolutely do not tolerate any form of discrimination. And if someone does engage in discrimination against someone else at the event, that they will be removed immediately, so that people are aware from the very beginning what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, and that you have established grounds for you to remove them if necessary. My next tip is to have support available. Please do not try to run an entire Zoom event all by yourself. Hopefully you have a couple members of your team or some trusted volunteers who are there to support you. I would recommend designated members of your team to facilitate the chat, as well as Q&A or polls, etc., as well as someone who just answers questions or comments from the audience, and then someone who deals with other issues as they may arise, such as if you do need to remove someone. And then my last tip is to think very carefully about sharing recordings of the event. You can always choose not to record in the first place, especially if there is participant involvement, if people are turning on their cameras or unmuting themselves to speak, or if speakers are not comfortable with the event being recorded. If you do choose to record, you want to let everyone know in advance, as well as remind them during the event so that they are aware. And if you choose to distribute that recording, you want to be intentional about how you're doing it. Sometimes it makes sense to make it publicly accessible, such as posting it on YouTube, and that's something you may want to do. Or maybe you want to just send it out to everyone who registered after the event, so that in case someone wasn't able to make it, they're still able to access the event in that way. Or maybe you just want it available to internal members of your organization so that you can look back on it later. These are all things you have to think carefully about. There's definitely no right or wrong answer, but you just want to make sure that whatever you decide, everyone who is involved is aware of you recording, as well as you potentially sharing the recording. Those are all of my best practices for hosting online events. I feel like I speed ran through that. I was worried about going over time, but I did want to just plug my email just in case anyone wants to reach out later. You're definitely you're definitely able to do that at any time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Avreet. Yeah, I think, doxing and infiltration is very real and maybe sometimes overlooked, which may be beneficial for us in some ways. But I think those are really important considerations to know, and that there are things we can do to protect ourselves in these spaces. So yeah, thank you all so much again for your incredible presentations. I know I definitely learned some things. I hope everyone found some takeaways. So now we're going to move into the moderated Q&A session.